Morning speaker, whose topic will be a crucible for humanism, Shaw's Pygmalion. Omar Kahn is now an avid New Yorker, but he was born in Egypt, of Pakistani heritage, and basically grew up in New York City. He has also lived in the UK, Japan, Singapore, Sri Lanka, the Netherlands, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, and Japan. How many languages do you speak? Omar is the founder of a consulting firm, Sensei International, which helps organizations engage human performance to deliver business results, and the founder of the International Business and Wine Society. He is a longtime devotee, gadfly, and benefactor of the Shaw Festival in Canada, the only festival devoted to the work and ideas of George Bernard Shaw, and has spoken previously at the Philadelphia Ethical Society on Kantian ethics and humanism, a topic on which he wrote a thesis at Oxford. Please welcome Omar Kahn.
Well, good morning. It's interesting because when we did the talk on Kantian humanism and Philadelphia in a, I guess, masochistic vein asked me to come back, I realized I'm not a member of the Kant Society, but am a Board of Governors member of the Shaw Festival. And so we went Shaw. Also, it was clear that My Fair Lady was about to have a revival, that Bedlam was going to do an off-Broadway version of Pygmalion. We did St. Joan at the Shaw Festival last year. St. Joan is currently being done by the Manhattan Theater Club. And Stoppard is doing travesties. He's a very Shavian writer. So after a long time in New York, Shaw was in the air. And so I wanted to talk about Shaw's Pygmalion, I think an often misunderstood play, as a crucible for humanism. So it'll be about 25-30 minutes, and then we'll make sure we can talk. So as ideas or questions percolate, please hang on to them. So Shaw was the first global brand we know of. He was a nobody from Ireland who invented a persona called GBS that captivated and electrified the world. And he inhabited that persona not just for self-promotion, but as a way to get the world's attention for a project he was very interested in, namely democratizing skepticism. He wanted people, not just those in power, to be able to intelligently and winningly express skepticism about prevailing paradigms, shibboleths, things that couldn't be questioned before. So Shaw was fascinated by all of us to become more than our mores, more than our class conditioning, more than our social reflexes. And he despised the play of manners that so dominated the European stage of his time, which he felt taught nothing. I am trying to stay true to the paper because I will be happy to send it to you in the aftermath. So feel free to just capture what you want, but I will email it to you, and that's why I'm trying to keep myself from doing my usual digressive off-ramps, which could take us into all kinds of fun, but maybe not germane areas. So Shaw's aim was to make us think first, feel second, so we had some sense of what our feelings relate to. Feelings do need some facts to inform them, or feelings can be groundlessly misdirected by prejudice, something we've all been learning in all kinds of encounters in the public sphere and otherwise. Shaw used humor to sugar the truths he wished us to consider. His annoyance was that people licked off the sugar rather than taking the pill to avoid thinking. And part of the problem was that he was such a wonderful humorist. So he was his own worst enemy. He couldn't contain himself. After the opening performance of Arms and the Man had people guffawing with such abandon, Shaw was sitting there quite morose, worrying that they might, in the midst of all the hilarity, be missing the point about the absurd romanticizing of war embedded in our culture. During the ovation that followed, one solitary person booed from the rafters. Shaw, who was up on stage receiving the ovation, didn't miss a beat. He said, "I agree with you, sir." He said, "But what are the two of us in the face of all this?" So, I mean, that is one of those things you cannot rehearse. Shaw, along with Ibsen, though in a very different way, helped transform the theater of the day from packed pieces about manners and contrivances towards a theater of ideas where humanity and inhumanity could be showcased. Pygmalion. Whatever its artistic merits, and these have been debated by Shavian scholars and enthusiasts since its publication, Shaw called it a romance. It's very interesting, with his wry take on common concepts. But he called it Pygmalion, drawn from the Greek legend of a sculptor who falls in love with his creation, a creation that then has to be brought to life by Aphrodite so that they can wed. He did not expect that this would become his most enduring popular success. From an Oscar-winning movie to a multi-award-winning musicalization by Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Loewe, which you can revisit today at the Lincoln Center, considered one of the greatest musicals of our time, but the source material, Pygmalion, has captivated our imaginations unremittingly. Why? In part, I think, because it looks at the web of human relationships, at mentorship, at the many hues of human concern and compassion, how avidly also we can be indifferent to people we care about, and how resolutely we objectify if we're not careful. Yet it does all this while also destabilizing classic expectations of the male as savior and the woman as someone needing to be saved. This is a marvelous moral and ethical romp, not just a dramatic one. The challenge, though, again, is that Shaw's play is so diverting, so amusing at times, and it is so delightful to see various pomposities get their comeuppance, that it is far too easy to trivialize what's happening. The story is on the surface of a flower girl, as we all know, guided by a phonetics professor wishing to win a bet, but really to demonstrate the power of his vocation that he is so passionate about, to change her accent and thereby her prospects, her standing in society, and ultimately her ability to find her own voice as she learns to drape her thoughts and feelings in beautifully spoken expression. The transformation of Eliza from flower girl to potential duchess, in linguistic and thereafter to some extent behavioral terms, is a fascinating and alchemical lab for us to look at as we consider how humans can or can't, do or don't, evolve in concert with each other. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions. The original misconception, seen through the lens of male dominance, what else, is it's the story of a man saving a woman, alleging that how we speak is transformative. There is some truth here. Tyrannies seek to bastardize and undermine language. Orwell warned about this. Many people warned about this. And Shaw is at one level making a point about how crucial language is and the importance of how we learn it and express it. But it's also the story of a self-absorbed genius for whom all his students are just fodder. They matter, but to the extent of mastering the subject, giving themselves to it for the greater glory of phonetics. However, the self-absorbed devotee of language and phonetics finds his sequestered world shaken by a storm of a foundational magnitude, nothing he envisaged signing up for when he took on this bet. The flower girl, talented beyond initial appearances, aren't we all to some extent, if met with a degree of openness rather than prejudice, affirmed rather than swatted away. With her native independence, with her ignorance of how to socially defer or show social gratitude, and with her burgeoning fighting spirit to prove the professor's confidence in her potential to be right, provokes, irks, destabilizes, challenges, vexes, and galvanizes. Now this at times makes for rich fun at the expense of everyone's mores, but Eliza is no diffident receptacle. This is a spirited, emotional woman, as painted by Shaw, who, yes, can be temporarily overwhelmed by her teacher and mentor and all that is new to her. Who wouldn't be? It's a totally new world for her, but who ultimately will not be cowed. And this is why she transcends being just a pupil to Higgins. Her inner fire infuriates and fascinates him. It is arguably what makes her humanity ultimately distinctive to him, despite his best attempts not to see it. And it must be contended with. Advertently in some ways, inadvertently in others, she stokes that fire. And the fire that he helps stoke, he gains grudging illumination from himself. And so if we only see this as Higgins liberating Eliza, rather than Eliza also, despite his best intentions, influencing and changing Higgins, we're missing half the equation. Now, modern misconceptions. The more current misconception is that this is about a talented lout being put in his place by the budding individual expression of a spirited woman. Partially true, but also distorting. Eliza, let's not forget, lives in Higgins' home. She has a support structure in the kindness of Colonel Pickering, who moves in recently himself, and the somewhat maternal oversight of the housekeeper, Mrs. Pierce. Higgins, for all his bullying and hectoring, his taunts, his shabby emotional bedside manners, is dedicated to her success, truly. He wants her, needs her to succeed. And while he may walk over her, towards that end at times, they dine together, they socialize together. He introduces her to her mother, who becomes one of her stalwart supporters, and to her mother's circle, brazenly. These are not the actions of a person who wants to undermine and destroy someone. He does very much become a conduit to a larger world. And this is why we have to beware of painting whole villains and whole heroes, and look at the greater complexity in the tapestry of who human beings actually are. Now, Eliza makes parts of that world very much her own, but she needs the raw material Higgins offers her so willingly, and in fact bountifully, to make it so. There is a dance here, perhaps more. This is a romance in the sense that Higgins romances Eliza's spirit by engaging her, by exposing her to beautiful settings and exciting opportunities, by providing a context for her to persevere and platforms for her quick ear and capacity for adaptation to express themselves. Now, Eliza, in turn, comes to care for Higgins. She says so herself. She has been willing to make herself vulnerable in order to respond to these opportunities. It's a different time and age, and you couldn't just leave and go join a university, especially if you were a flower girl selling flowers at the corner of Tottenham Court Road. She agrees to live in relatively intimate surroundings with two men after having a father who was certainly far from an exemplar of how men should behave, who looked at his daughter as primarily a source of income. She's naturally hurt, of course, by Higgins' frequent behavioral indifference, deeply stung at times. But when she accuses him of not caring about her in the aftermath of a great social success, where she shines as a lady, charging him with thinking of her only as a means to winning his bet, he is incensed, confessing, "You have wounded me to the heart," he says. This is a shocking emotional confession for Higgins, given his armor of emotional detachment. Now, we can say Eliza does come to have deep affection for Higgins, but refuses to be enthralled to him. The person she is becoming is too important to become anyone's trinket. The person she is becoming wishes not to be adored or admired, but affirmed and loved. And Higgins comes to grudgingly love her, quixotically. Not that he'd ever admit it, as much as he can love anyone. And there's the rub. He says, I quote, "I have learnt something from your idiotic notions. I confess that humbly and gratefully. and I've grown accustomed to your voice and appearance. I like them rather. Of course, in My Fair Lady, this becomes the famous song, I've grown accustomed to her face. When Eliza suggests he can turn on the gramophone to listen to the recordings, as the gramophone has no feelings to hurt, he says, but I can't turn your soul on. Leave me those feelings, and you can take away the voice and the face. They are not you. She knows he's trying to get around her anger, but there is truth there nonetheless. And that's actually a very piquant moment when he says, leave me that, because I can't turn your soul on. So it's a romance of both purposeful and inadvertent growth. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the author of Le Petit Prince, writing in a very different vein, suggested, perhaps love is the process of my leading you gently back to yourself. Not to who I wish you were, but to who you are. So here this happens. They're both inadvertently led back to themselves, not as a terminus, but as a point of departure, with both their selves expanding, though perhaps not gently at all. So Pygmalion versus My Fair Lady, the ending. So Shavians think the My Fair Lady ending is a cop-out. In Pygmalion, to the surprise and shock of many, Eliza and Higgins don't reconcile. She opts to marry Freddie, her bumbling suitor, instead. However, we should admit on the face of it, even there, the ending is inconclusive. Eliza in Pygmalion heads off with Mrs. Higgins to see her father get married. So, she's going to see her declassed father married against all his protests. We'll leave that as a discussion for another time. But as she leaves, she tells Higgins she has placed calls to organize the household, reminds the professor about neckties he's forgotten, and the cheese he needs to order, and more. What you are to do without me, she says, I cannot imagine. With all the speculation, therefore, that this ending engendered, because that's not a, F off. It's a, I'm not coming back, but by the way, here are your neckties, here's your cheese, here's whatever. I've placed calls to make sure things are sorted out. Shaw was so annoyed that people thought this was ambiguous that he had to intervene and offer a sequel. Actually, an epilogue. If you've never read it, it's a bit of fun. The purpose of the epilogue is to confirm, lest anybody doubted, that Eliza marries Freddie, but also confirms her ongoing close affiliation with the household, getting periodic help in her life and support from the Colonel and Higgins, periodically aggravating Higgins to the point that the Colonel has to ask her to be kinder to him. But absent a rather robust emotional bond, why would she be able to get to him so? Right? And who gets to you more than the people closest to you? Who drives you more mad than the people you love most? Right? I mean, indifference is the real sin. So why would she relish doing so herself? And towards the end of the epilogue, even Shaw has Eliza thinking about what it might be like to get Higgins alone without all his social and personal reinforcements on a desert isle where he would have to perhaps just make love like any other man. But it's just an imagining, Shaw assures us. And that Galatea, the statue brought to life by Aphrodite, never does quite like Pygmalion. He writes, his relation to her is too godlike to be altogether agreeable. Well, she may not like him. But even Shaw, though, can't and won't say she doesn't love him. My Fair Lady, on the surface, has Eliza going back to Higgins, and I've read more claptrap about this ending than I can recount. And the film, actually the film version with Leslie Howard first did that while Shaw was still alive. They didn't tell him they were doing it. And he just sat there with a sort of pained smile, and then won an Oscar for the movie. But the musical's ending is actually inconclusive. Go back to the movie if you want, or to the play. I'm talking about the Rex Harrison, Audrey Hepburn. Higgins, after Eliza here in this version, storms out, not to church, engages in a remarkable musical tour de force, of course raging against her, angrily belittling her choice of Freddie, but then succumbing to his feelings and confessing in that radiant moment that her joys, her woes, her highs, her lows, are second nature to me now, like breathing out and breathing in. He concludes simply, I've grown accustomed to the trace of something in the air, accustomed to her face. And then he sits shattered. Rex Harrison, face buried in his hands, listening to her on the gramophone. Eliza slips in, substitutes her living voice for the recording. He sits up shocked, relieved, as joyous as he can let himself be. And all he can get himself to say is, Eliza? And once he's sure it is, in mock annoyance, where the devil are my slippers? And she smiles, presumably having seen the recently distraught man now enlivened by her presence. Despite what I don't know. Let me not put a label on it. It is so easy. She does not run to get his slippers. She's already thrown them at him. He's already said he likes her more for throwing them at him. And he has no respect. It's just he said it because he couldn't find anything else to say. And the actual stage instructions in My Fair Lady are, he wants to run to her, but can't bring himself to. And all he can get out is, where the devil are my slippers? And she smiles, understanding. Because what was she going to do? Say, you didn't metamorphose into the perfect guy in 30 seconds of my walking in? I'm out of here. No, she was wiser than that. The London revival with Jonathan Pryce dealt with it, I think, even better. Eliza looks at him after he says, where the devil are my slippers, in mock irritation, as if to say, really? He gets up, tries to look stern, and they both lose it, laughing delightedly as the music swells, clearly equals. What Bartlett Sher has done, maybe I shouldn't say. Should I? Shouldn't I? Okay. Only because it's a spoiler in a sense. What he's done is that at the beginning of the play, Eliza stands apart while the action is happening. So she's with us. It's called breaching the fourth wall in theater. Then she enters the action. At the end, when she comes back and she caresses his face, she doesn't walk out. There's a door for walking out in the play. She walks back to us, i.e. through the wall, signifying that she's occupying her own space again. And that's, Bartlett Sher said, I didn't change the ending. I left it as open as I think Shaw would have wanted, and even Lerner and Lowe were trying to suggest, because what happens next, even in the original version, in the movie? We don't know. The piece might last a day before Shaw's predictions came true, and she went back to Freddie. Or perhaps in this alternative universe, because she left, and saw Higgins, facing to his horror how much of a blow that would be, opening a window to other possibilities, perhaps. Depictions of Higgins as an erudite but essentially overbearing ogre miss so much of the richness of the tale. We heard a paper at a Shaw conference suggesting that Emma, Lady Hamilton, known colloquially as Lord Nelson's mistress, might have been the inspiration for Eliza. So after an impoverished young life, this was an actual lady, of course, and an early career as an actress and entertainer, shall we say euphemistically, for various well-heeled men, she was taken under the wing of Charles Francis Granville, second son of the Earl of Warwick. He took her in, apparently had a civilizing impact on her, but of course they were also lovers. It was assumed. And she went on to become the muse of the artist George Romney, another affair. But then again, he was good to her, and when Grenville had to marry somebody else for money, or his family would have cut him off, she became the wife of Sir William Hamilton, and after his death, the mistress of Lord Nelson. In the words Shaw uses, she literally became consort for a king. Not literally, but close enough. But note with Higgins, there are no sexual favors involved. He takes in someone he barely knows, towards whom social disdain would have prohibited most people from any optimism, and he does it for the sheer intellectual challenge and thrill. He mentors her, exposes her to society, welcomes to his home, And even when she refutes him eventually, continues to care about her, if not for her, if that's a step too far for him. Even as per Shaw's sequel, she's in and out of the home. He is undoubtedly a liberating influence in her life, and he can't quite let that go. When challenged in the musical by Pickering for acting as if Eliza doesn't matter at all, Higgins says, and I quote, "What could possibly matter more than to take a human being and change her into a different human being by creating a new speech for her? Why, it's filling the deepest gulf that separates class from class and soul from soul. She matters immensely." He knew that back then, if you heard a Cockney accent, that was it. You were in a caste. I mean, C-A-S-T-E. Later, when Eliza points out that Colonel Pickering treats her, a flower girl, as if she was a duchess, Higgins says, and I treat a duchess as if she was a flower girl. And when his attempts at influencing her and browbeating her fail in the face of her budding personhood, rather than recoil from her, remember in both versions he says, 5 minutes ago you were a millstone around my neck. Now you're a tower of strength, a consort battleship. In the musical he adds what in Pygmalion he conceded prior, I like you this way. It's clear he does. So this imperfect teacher, this flawed human, this emotionally unintelligent philosopher and professor of linguistics did something for Eliza no normal person would have done. He enabled her to create a new life with no real reward other than her presence. He won a bet, but it's clear the bet was incidental to the excitement of the enterprise. No one with a conventional definition of kindness, with the charm of Pickering, the expected youthful ardor of Freddie, had ever looked beyond her sooty exterior. No mainstream person would have done anything so radical or inspired her own creative imagination as Higgins did. It took a real original, maddening as he was and could be. So it's a tale of Eliza's courage, valor, and independent spirit for sure, but also of the unusual personal and professional commitment of Higgins to her flourishing. Here is a world between them that eventually transcends the social mores, exposes their mutual hypocrisies, where reason, fellowship, and competence enable aspirations. Minds and hearts both are educated despite the emotional volatility. Now, there have been many other plays who have taken a leaf from Pygmalion. Willie Russell's Educating Rita. Everybody seen the Michael Caine, Julie Walters movie? I mean, well worth seeing otherwise. John Morell's Taking Shakespeare. At the Stratford Festival come to mind. Stratford, that's the other festival. I can occasionally say that. As you know from Educating Rita, the teacher is not teaching phonetics but using English literature and companionship to impart a culture. And Rita too finds her own, grows past her own social and cultural moorings as well as outgrowing her teacher. In the latter, Taking Shakespeare, a slacker, ADD student runs into a burned out teacher, and over Othello, the teacher is renewed and the student is awakened. But never has a dalliance between teacher and student, between a creative catalyst and the person creating themselves, with the eventual inversion of who is the most powerful, been portrayed so unforgettably, so thoroughly, with such romance, as in Shaw's marvelous, challenging, provocative tale. Shaw, enjoyed the to and fro with many people, and sometimes people said he was never serious. There's that wonderful story we've all heard of him sending a note to Winston Churchill, with whom he was a close friend, even though they disagreed violently about communism, for example. But he said, "Here are 2 tickets to the opening night of Pygmalion. Feel free to bring a friend if you have one." To which Churchill, no stranger to such jousts, wrote back, "Cannot attend opening night, will attend second one if you have one." And, you know, I mean, they got on, you know, like a house on fire in a strange way, where Churchill said the greatest living man of letters is Shaw. He says saint, sage, and clown. And he said we never know when he's being which. Chesterton, another man with whom he disagreed in many ways, had their fun. Chesterton once said to Shaw, he said, looking at you, one would think there's a famine in the country, because he was very slender. And Shaw looked at him and said, looking at you, one would think you were the cause. Chesterton was rather stout. Had a nice prosperity of diameter, of which I know. But Shaw, when he was a tad more serious, wrote these marvelous lines with which I will bring this to a close so we can talk. This is his thought of what we are here to contribute while here in this plane of existence. He says, "This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one. The being a force of nature instead of a feverish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion," he says, "that my life belongs to the whole community, and as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live." By the way, his death was precipitated by his falling out of a tree he was pruning at the age of 94. I'm not making that up. Somebody asked him what that was like. He said it hurt. He says, "I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle for me. It is a sort of splendid torch, which I've got hold of for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations." Well, reading Pygmalion offers a crucible, a world where we fashion choices for ourselves, but with each other, where fresh stimuli liberates when offered, and teacher and student exchange roles, where love comes in many forms, and being open to shedding our limiting selves and having the courage and creativity to claim a larger life and then be accountable for it creates new worlds of possibility, both for ourselves and those in our ambit. It is when interactions have that texture, when we embrace each other as mutual architects of possibility, not as labels, that together we literally exfoliate a better future. Thank you very much.
One question, but thank you. That was a wonderful speech. I just want to share a quote you may know. Independence, that's middle class blasphemy. All of us are interdependent. Every living soul, everyone on earth.
Yeah, that's from Pygmalion.
Yes.
And it is, it's a wonderful response after he runs into Alfred P. Doolittle, a common dustman.
Thank you.
But thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yes.
Your current production at Lincoln Center of My Fair Lady is a must-see.
Yes.
People can get a ticket. It really is marvelous.
It is. It freshens the source material without in any way trying to overly reinterpret it. It was always by Shaw a radical, and I think the danger was actually earlier productions which tried to put conventional romance onto it, when what Shaw was doing was showing something far more bracing, far more complex.
And on the street where you live, it's never been so well.
Yes, I mean that Freddie, who has just that moment, that spasm of classical romantic ardor, but Haddon Smith, Lauren Ambrose, Norbert Leo Butz, they all do a wonderful job. The Shaw Festival, by the way, for its 50th year, we're now in our 56th year, in Canada, did My Fair Lady after 50 years of refusing to. And then it became our all-time bestseller. which shows that even Shaw can't sometimes have the last word of something of his that, radiates outward. Yes, please.
Tell the Isadora Duncan story to us. It's such a wonderful story.
Let me just take that question and I'll come right. Yeah.
You can see him afterwards. He's going to stay for lunch, so we can just have.
Yeah.
I'd love your thoughts on why she ends up marrying a bungler, and also what about the relationship between Pickering and what's his name?
Higgins, yes. Well, again, it's only in Shaw's version that she ends up marrying the bumpkin. And I think in one way, because she feels that he genuinely loves her. There's that line where he says, that makes him, that's all I need out of him. He said, so that makes him king enough for me. And I think also she wants to do for Freddie a little bit of what Higgins did for her. Not so much through changing his language, but by emboldening him, and then discovers that he just doesn't have the will for it, and that she's actually smarter, savvier, despite having been, cast in that, position by society. On the My Fair Lady side, I think, the idea was that she would eventually look at that and say, I don't need it to be either or. And, Lerner and Lowe said, why not leave it open as to what happens next and let Eliza decide, not in 10 minutes or in a moment of anger, when she says, I'll marry Freddie, almost to flaunt, the fact I have choices. I don't have to come back to be trod underfoot by you, but why not let it be, an evolving choice? So, yes, sir.
She could not marry Higgins. It would spoil the story, and it would spoil the two characters.
Right. Well, the fact is, it's a mystery. We don't know. It would certainly spoil the characters as they are today. Now, what might happen along the way, I don't know, because I suppose, but certainly coming back to marry him would destroy the play, because he's not there, and she's just discovering herself. But the fact that she needn't repudiate him either, and the fact that they could be, in some ways, more intimate than lovers, just because of what they've been through together.
To me, that's more satisfying.
Yeah, to me, I'm open to the mystery, and say, let's leave it there. So there's three hands.
And then we'll have to.
Yeah, so I'm going to do it in the order I saw you, not because of anything else. 1, 2, and then 3. Yes. And okay, one, if you permit me, but you'll decide. Yes.
You didn't mention anything about the play in a historical context, a cultural context, and many people speak of it as a feminist statement, where the female, her character, exhibits so much independence as a surrogate for women in general. Don't you think that is?
No, it is. I was really examining the play as a play, but Shaw has always had strong women characters. Mrs. Warren's Profession, which scandalized everyone, was his attempt to point out that if you're going to put women in a position where they either have to submit to the commercial, what he considered prostitution of marriage, or the commercial prostitution out there, why wouldn't she run that business, make it safe, sane, etc.? He makes a similar argument about war in Major Barbara. Shaw was of the belief that economic necessities drive that kind of immoral behavior. Of course, then Eliza is somebody who learns to have it both ways. She retains her essential innocence, but gains the ability. I would argue she doesn't lose her own voice, she adds to it. Her accent changes, but she's still Eliza. St. Joan, of course, which won him the Nobel Prize, was again an extraordinary way to tell a story without making her either seem utterly supernatural or just like the rebel down the corner. So I fully agree with you that for Shaw, carving out I mean, he always thought that men were an evolutionary prank as sperm donors. I mean, at various times he just got very annoyed and said that's how we behave. And so you're absolutely right. By the way, just a very quick sidebar. He won an Oscar for My Fair Lady, for Pygmalion. He won the Nobel Prize for St. Joan, becoming until recently the only human, until Bob Dylan joined him, of winning both an Oscar and a Nobel Prize. They're the only two. And I don't know whether Dylan followed Shaw's example, but Shaw refused to go and collect the prize and said take the money and give it over to developing Scandinavian artists. And Strindberg was one of those who benefited. A little bit of, a lark. Yes?
Yeah, I was going to make a similar point, which is the play has is showing the different gender relations and the different class relations. And for her to marry him, it would be suggest that she's better off leaving her class, where it's sort of saying that they're transcending this hierarchy, and she's sort of choosing that she doesn't have to be absorbed within her teacher, that she can have an independent path.
So the productions that have them exchange a kiss immediately after that, I think, are as wrong. To do that as Lerner and Lowe thought Shaw was in slamming the door. Now Shaw's play doesn't slam the door because I said she's ordering cheese as she leaves and telling him, showing you who's in a sense more powerful. Yeah, buddy, I'm not repudiating you, but I ain't coming back, in those terms. I think that our need to want it to be either or would be the tragedy. There is a both and formulation here that leaves open the mystery of whatever happens next in human relations. But certainly, neither do I think Higgins was asking. I mean, he'd be frightened to death of marrying her. I mean, it's not as if he was, I've grown accustomed to the trace of something in the air, but it's like, no, my God, can you imagine? I mean, so yeah, I think they both would have had some growing to do. Yes, ma'am.
So you didn't talk about her father, but we just watched the movie last night, and her father has the scene where he comes all dressed up.
The My Fair Lady or Pygmalion movie? Uh-huh. Morality, yes.
Yeah, so what was Shaw?
So Shaw was arguing that people are made immoral by economics. They're not poor because they're immoral, they're made immoral because they're poor. And that there are some people who are extraordinary and escape that. But if that's the bet you're placing, just like he thought if you put rockets in the hands of immature people and elect them to power and think wars won't break out, I mean, he just thought that was, absurdly wishful thinking. And so he takes this guy who says, listen, you need me to be the undeserving poor for your whole setup to work. Well, then he becomes a lecturer. Now everybody wants him. He's the same person. But now the things that he said, taking money off people, now he doesn't need to hit anybody else up for money, are being called wisdom. And they say, why don't you give it back? And he says, I haven't the nerve. He says, we're all intimidated. So I think it was what Shaw was saying, was that economics and whether people have other options and how we treat people who are in those situations, whether there are off-ramps, opportunities, to some extent will determine where they head. Unless they happen to walk into a quirky fellow like Higgins who writes you a referral to a dying millionaire.
One last question.
Omar, you're a well-traveled person, you speak many languages. Does the Cockney accent still exist in London?
Yes, it's become kind of sexy now. It's become cool, so that people hang on to it. Who I know don't, but it's almost become a badge of pride that you're not going to sort of, judge me for it. And it's now almost become a joke if you speak with a very plush blue nose accent. People say, oh my God, you sound rather constipated. So somewhere in between there, people are finding their own voice, just as I think in this country, we've discovered that there are more than one idiom. That marvelous line by Mark Twain, he says, they spell it Vinci. They pronounce it Vinchy. Foreigners always spell better than they pronounce. Yes, sir.
We should remember that the mantra of our society is to bring out the best in another and thereby in yourself.
Exactly, and I would say that's a fitting finale to what Pygmalion is about, just showing that it happens sometimes because of us, sometimes despite us, but ride the waves however it happens. Thank you again.